All right, welcome to our first topic for our final module here. We're beginning with the 1990s, having already gone through the decades before that, talking about the different transitions that occur between each decade, the revolutionary 1960s, the destructive 1970s, and then the very conservative 1980s. We've gone through and looked at the different patterns that have emerged in each decade, and now we're moving into the 1990s, which is going to be a transformative decade for the United States as well. Note that you have two identifications to look at for this topic, the Gulf War and the prison-industrial complex, so make sure that you make note of those as we go along. We're picking up with the 1990s with the Gulf War. If you remember, we talked about the end of the Cold War occurred in 1989 with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. And this ends this 50-ish year conflict, and the Gulf War is going to be the first post-Cold War conflict that we have, which makes it very interesting to look at how we're going to handle conflict outside of this containment mentality that we've been in for the past 50 years. We have switched presidents. Ronald Reagan ran for election in 1980 and then again in 1984, but in 1988 his time is up, and his vice president, George H.W. Bush, this guy right here, he's going to take over, and he will be president in 1990 when the Gulf War begins. Now, the Gulf War begins in 1990 because Iraq decides to invade Kuwait. It's all about oil over in the Middle East, and Saddam Hussein, who is the dictator of Iraq, wants the oil that he can find in Kuwait. And the reason that the United States is concerned about this is because we're worried that he'll move from Kuwait into Saudi Arabia, which is where we get the majority of our oil. That's our ally in the Middle East, and we don't want Iraq and Saddam Hussein in there at all. It's also important to note that we really don't like Saddam Hussein. He's not very nice to his people, and he refuses to obey weapons laws that we've put forth through the UN. And so we already have a problem with Saddam Hussein. We are happy enough to go to war with him. So the war begins with Desert Storm. This is the operation. And we remove the Iraqi troops from Kuwait. Okay, so we kick Iraq back out of Kuwait. We prevent an invasion in Saudi Arabia, and everything is successful. Bush's ratings will increase because of this, but one of the things that we do is that we will leave an American presence lingering in both Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And so that's the other part of the significance here. The first component of significance of the Gulf War is that it's the first post-Cold War conflict. The second part is that our influence in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War causes a lot of anger in Saudi Arabia, which happens to be where Osama bin Laden is living at the time. And the Gulf War is what will really infuriate him about the United States and be the turning point in his life that leads him on a path to create a terrorist organization that is ultimately going to attack the United States on September 11th of 2001. So it's important to note that that really begins here. Also in the 1990s, we have a technology revolution happening. This begins in the 1980s, but it really kicks off, takes hold, and changes the culture in the 1990s. We have video games, cell phones, personal computers, and digital cameras, all that are becoming part of people's day-to-day lives. These things are now affordable. People can access them. They're in most homes. By the mid-1990s, almost every middle-class family will have a personal computer at somewhere in their home. And of course, the internet is going to create a communication revolution. This has never been part of your world, probably, but there was a time when somebody needed to know something, they had to find somebody who knew it, or they had to go read it in a book, or they had to read a newspaper or an article. It was a very different thing. You couldn't just do a Google search. You couldn't ask Alexa a question. If you wanted to know what the weather was going to be for the week, you had to wait until the weather was on the television and then watch the weather predictions there. If you wanted to know what happened on this day in history, you had to go to a library and you had to find some sort of book that would tell you that information. When the internet takes off, it revolutionizes how people engage in communication. We have text messaging, we have things like AOL and Yahoo Messenger that allow instant communication between people. This is going to bring about globalization, which basically means that business goes international. Now people in completely different countries can communicate with each other just as easily as you can communicate with somebody across town. And so it gives the opportunity for businesses to all become international businesses. This is going to increase trade and profits and cooperation. It's going to create jobs. And all of this is going to work together to create a booming economy in the 1990s. But what we call a booming economy that occurs like that, we say that it's a bubble. It's like this bubble is growing and growing and growing in the economy, and it's growing so fast and so out of control that people are amazed, but at some point that bubble is going to be popped because it's not real sustainable growth. It's just this incredible inflation that is the result of a moment in time. And so the first crash of the 1990s technology economy happened in 2001. The economy is going to correct itself. It will correct itself again in 2007 and is now more steady and hopefully gaining all the time. One of the things that technology produces is something called a dot-com millionaire, which was a name given to people who tried to make their fortunes on the internet before everybody realized that people were scamming them on the internet. These would be people who were selling, amazing nutritional products or something like that, that they wanted you to not only buy, but they wanted you to buy enough of it that you could go and sell it to other people, and they would get the profit from that. So people who made their fortunes on the early stages of the internet through these kinds of schemes were called dot-com millionaires. While the economy is booming and technology is doing great, we have struggles in the 1990s. One of the most significant of those struggles is our prison system. In the 1990s, we see a retreat from the civil rights revolution of the 1960s and 1970s. The 1980s had brought about things like drug wars and being hard on crime, and we have a lot of people in prisons, particularly a lot of Black Americans in prisons in the 1990s. A lot of that is because we have very long prison sentences for drug crimes because of that war on drugs. So people could be caught for the first time in possession of or dealing a drug and end up in prison for 20, 30 plus years for that one crime. And so in 2008, we have a prison population of 2.3 million. This is an unsustainable number of people in the long term because we just don't have the money to provide the kind of standard of living that is expected to be maintained even in prisons for this many people if we can't maintain a humane standard of living. And so in the 1990s, we begin to see things like prison industrial complexes begin. This is where private prisons would use prisoners to generate income. So a lot of prison systems are owned privately. They're not government institutions, although we might think that they are. They're actually owned privately. Somebody or some people own them. And in order to have money to pay for these things, they started using prisoners to generate income, either by having them make license plates or having them do highway work or some other job that prisoners could do to help generate income that would go to the prison, theoretically for the purpose of paying for the cost of living that these people are incurring. A lot of times these were corrupt systems, and the money would end up going straight into the hands of the people who owned the prison and not ever be turned back into the prison system. So there's a lot of corruption that is happening with the prison industrial complex. One example of a prison industrial complex that takes place in Arkansas is with Cummins Prison in the 1980s. And this was a little bit before the prison industrial complex concept really takes off in the 1990s, but you see a few early birds trying out this system. At the Cummins Prison, the prison owners decided to start having prisoners generate income by forcing them to sell their blood, to give their blood to medical agencies that then went and sold that blood to hospitals that needed it for blood transfusions. Well, we didn't understand AIDS very well at the time, and so nobody was testing these prisoners' blood before it was given. And so we end up in Arkansas specifically selling to Canadian companies a lot of blood that is HIV infected. and that leads to an outbreak of HIV in Canada. So you can see that these prison industrial complex systems were not always the right answer. But it's significant because it demonstrates what a problem we have within our prison system at the time. One thing that almost everybody thinks about when they think of America in the 1990s is Bill Clinton, who was president in the United States from 1992 to 2000. Obviously, he comes from Arkansas. He's a combination of a liberal and a conservative. He would be liberal because he's pro-choice, pro-gay rights, pro-affirmative action, but he's also a conservative in the sense that he is for the reduction of government. He's anti-welfare. In a lot of ways, he's almost libertarian in the sense that he wants for people to have individual free choices. He's socially liberal, but when it comes to how to run the government, he would be much more conservative in the sense that wanting a balanced budget and less regulation. In many ways, he continues Reagan's economic policies throughout the 1990s. He's also very charismatic and relatable. He's going to win by a landslide. But from the very, very beginning, Republicans don't like him at all. He's a Democrat. And in a minute, we're going to discuss why the Republicans dislike him so strongly. First, one of the things that Bill Clinton is most famous for is balancing the budget. He was president during a time when the economy was doing really, really well, and he used that to be able to help balance the United States government so that we were not spending infinitely more than we were supposed to be spending. And so he is known for being really good in terms of managing the economy. But of course, Bill Clinton's presidency is going to be overshadowed by the affair that he has with Monica Lewinsky. Now, as I mentioned just a moment ago, Republicans intensely dislike Clinton. Republicans at this point in the early 1990s are embracing family values. They're embracing conservatism, religion, and they view Clinton as the antithesis, the opposite of all of those things. He smoked pot when he was young. He protested the Vietnam War. He married a feminist. He supported gay rights. He valued multiculturalism. He's a baby boomer. He's a 1960s wild child, liberal-minded man, and here he is taking the presidency, winning by a landslide, and the Republicans in Congress, they hate him because they're worried that he's going to undo everything that the conservatives worked through all throughout the 1980s. And then, within this context of the Republicans disliking Clinton, he shoots himself in the foot, essentially. He provides them with a lit match that they need through his sexual misconduct with Monica Lewinsky. He has an affair with Monica Lewinsky. This comes out. Monica Lewinsky shared the details of her affair with Bill Clinton with a friend of hers who began recording their phone calls and then leaked those phone calls to the press. Monica Lewinsky believed herself to be in love with Bill Clinton and was very much invested in the relationship and talked a lot about this to her friend, who then betrayed her with the press. And so all of this comes out, and it's a huge scandal for Bill Clinton. Now, it's not that he's impeached for sexual misconduct. What he's impeached for is the fact that when he is initially called before Congress to testify about the alleged scandal, he says, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." That's one of Bill Clinton's most famous lines. That, he later admitted, was a lie. And so what he is impeached for is perjury. He lied on the stand to Congress. And so they impeach him, they put him on trial. During that trial by Congress in 1999, he is acquitted on all accounts, and he is not removed from office. So he is impeached, but he is not removed. And although many people disliked Clinton, many conservatives in the South in particular disliked Clinton, he continues to be so popular after this event that it really shows that although we have this conservative movement in the 1980s and early 1990s, it demonstrates that there has been an irreversible shift away from traditional values. And there are more people in the United States who are willing to overlook such things than there are people who are willing to say, no, absolutely not. We do not allow this kind of behavior from the President of the United States. And so his continued popularity demonstrates this important shift. And this event will, of course, overshadow much of the rest of his presidency. He did a number of very good things while he was in office with the economy and with foreign relations. But he is most remembered for the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Many people say that if Clinton had been able to run again in 2000, that he probably would have won. But of course, he wasn't eligible to run. And so that puts us with George W. Bush, pictured here, versus Al Gore, pictured here, for the election in 2000. Bush was the Republican, Gore was the Democrat, and you could not have two more different men. George W. Bush came from a presidential family. His father was George H.W. Bush, back from the Gulf War, who we just talked about. And he was a good old boy from Texas. He was um, casual, he was laid back, he just wanted to talk to people and connect. One of the criticisms was that he didn't express himself very well, that he seemed or he sounded unintelligent because of how loosely he spoke. Al Gore was exactly the opposite. Al Gore was rigid. He was an intellectual. When he gave speeches, he used a lot of big words and complicated arguments, and that ended up losing the audience half the time. So they were very different men. In fact, to put it very stereotypically, here we have George H.W. Bush, a good old boy from Texas, and then Al Gore was an intellectual nerd. And so these two men are running against each other in 2000. Al Gore will win the popular vote, but the electoral vote is too close to call. They can't tell who actually won the electoral vote. And it all comes down to Florida. They're not sure what the vote was in Florida, and Florida holds a lot of electoral votes. And so it's very important to know which way that state went in order to determine who became president. And so people are concerned that the vote is too close to call in Florida, and they demand recounts. And so we recount the votes, and we recount the votes, and we recount the votes again and again and again for about a month. The election was in early November. Finally, on December 12th, the House of Representatives demands that the recount ends. They take a vote within their committee, and they determine that Florida went to Bush, and that means that Bush won the election. Now, the country is incredibly polarized about this. Some people are thrilled that George H.W. Bush won George W. Bush won the election. And some people think that this is the death of democracy because Al Gore won the popular vote, and they believed that Congress, Republican-controlled Congress, should have voted for him in the case of a situation where it was too close to tell. Instead, they gave it to the Republican candidate, and so a lot of people, about 50% of the country, are furious about this decision. And it doesn't give George W. Bush a very good mandate to go into office on. And unfortunately, he's going to very quickly need that mandate that he doesn't have when not too long after he takes office, we are faced with 9/11, which is where we will pick up with the next lecture whenever you're ready.